Hello and welcome to Ask an Author with Julia Kelly. I'm really thrilled because today we have a very special guest for a very special experiment that we're doing here on Ask an Author. We are running a book club, which means this is going to be a wonderful spoiler-filled conversation all about my friend Fiona Davis's wonderful book, The Magnolia Palace. Hello, Fiona.
Thank you for having me. I'm thrilled to be here. And it's thank you for doing this and for everything you're doing to connect authors and readers. We really appreciate it, especially since you're an esteemed author yourself. This means so much.
Well, thank you. Well, I have to say, I like getting a chance to chat with people, and I absolutely have loved all the questions that have been coming in throughout the month as people have been reading the book. And, we gave people a little bit of a chance to, know what we were going to be talking about a month in advance, ask them questions, leave comments, let us know where they are. So now we're finally at the actual day of the book club, which I'm very excited about. So if you guys want to go ahead and introduce yourselves, let us know where you are. And if you have any questions, go ahead and leave those in the comments. And I'll be going ahead and using my trusty iPad here to check them throughout the conversation. But I thought very easy start. I just ask you, what was it that inspired you to write this book in particular?
Yeah. The Magnolia Palace, it's my sixth book. I can't believe it. And, every book is set in a landmark New York City building. And so as I was finishing up the fifth book, The Lions of Fifth Avenue, I was always, walking around New York and on the hunt for what the next book, what the next setting will be, because that's where I start. And I remember seeing the Frick collection, which is one of my favorite museums. It's a lesser known museum than, say, the Guggenheim or the Met, which are, super famous. It's small. And what I really loved about it in terms of picking it as a setting was that it was first a residence. It was the home for Henry Clay Frick, who was a big industrialist and a big art collector and very controversial, as well as his wife Adelaide and his adult daughter Helen. And then later, after Adelaide died in the 30s, it was turned into a museum because, of course, there was this amazing art collection on the walls. And so when you walk inside, it really feels like it's frozen in time, and like the Frick family might be back any minute from a dinner party. And I think that's what makes it so special and why so many New Yorkers say that's their favorite museum, hands down. And so it just made sense to set it there. I loved the art. I loved the family was fascinating. And then the house itself is really beautiful. And I thought, let me try that. And I was worried, though, I have to say, because it's not one of the most well-known places in New York. It's not like the library, it's not like Grand Central. And so it's a little kind of special that way. So the response has just been incredible. I'm so grateful.
Well, I have to say, you know my backstory of being a former New Yorker myself. And I have to admit, I never went to the Frick. It was always high up there on my list, but in 9 years, I never made it there, which was pretty shameful. So I have to admit, I loved reading the book because it was very new to me, which can be sometimes you feel when you've lived in that city for a long time that nothing's new, you've seen it all before. But I was so delighted to see that this was the place that you had decided to set this book. And it sounds like an absolutely fascinating place to visit.
Yeah, it really is. I do have to say, it seems like whatever place I pick tends to close down right before the book gets published. So for the public library, it was closed for COVID right before the book came out. The Chelsea Hotel has been closed for renovations for years. And unfortunately, the Frick collection, the actual house, is closed for renovations. And that happened last year, but it will be opening in about a year or so. And in the meantime, they've moved most of the artwork, including a lot of the artwork that's talked about in the book, to the Frick Madison, which is just a few blocks away, and an incredible place to go and view the artwork. So if there's any New Yorkers out there who want to go check it out, definitely go see the Frick Madison. I highly recommend it.
Well, I'm hoping to get back to New York sometime this year, and I think it's going to have to be on the list. I did just see somebody fly by in the comments saying that they're on chapter 8. I just want to reiterate, this is going to be a very spoiler-filled conversation. We're going to be talking about everything all the way to the very end of this book. So if you don't want this book to be spoiled, this is your fair warning. But I think we'll go ahead and jump in with a question from somebody talking about actually the author's note and something you mentioned there. Mary Beth has a question. She says, in the author's note, you tell us about the character, how the character of Lillian / Angelica was based on a real person. Can you talk about how your inspiration for Veronica and Joshua developed?
Yeah. So just real quick about Lillian, because I think a lot of people, are intrigued by that. Just to chat about that, she was this very famous model in the early 1900s, and her image is actually carved on the top of the building. You can see it on the cover. That's her image carved above the entrance to the Frick. And so, yeah, that was really interesting to include that in the author's note, because she's inspired by a real person, Audrey Munson, who lived this incredibly interesting life. And a lot of people have kind of been shocked to hear about the fact that Audrey Munson is all over Manhattan on all of these statues, and still is around today. And now finally people are learning her name, which is kind of wonderful. And so Veronica and Joshua are in the 1960s section. So they're in the modern part of the book. And for that, I really wanted almost like a closed mystery to see if I could do that. And so I limited that time to, it's only 2 or 3 days. It's all pretty much set at the Frick mansion. And there's basically 2 characters, Veronica and Joshua, in the story. And it was a way to give myself a challenge. Having written so many dual timeline novels already, just to see what would happen if I gave myself those kind of strict confines. And so Veronica is completely made up. I thought, it'd be fun to have this English model who's a bit of a fish out of water. And she's at the Frick mansion, and she and Joshua kind of start on this scavenger hunt as they're trying to possibly find this missing diamond. And Joshua came about because as I was doing research into the Frick art collection and to the art history world in general, I was really struck by what's missing, and that is diverse perspectives. Mm-hmm. And that you have all of this art history, and so much is missing about the artists of color and Black artists who helped shape it, but may not be on the walls. And so I started reaching out to curators and art world experts who were Black and saying, all right, what was your experience like? What was it like, coming up somewhere in the 60s and 70s? And they talked about how tough it was, because it's hard to break into the art world if you're anyone, but never mind, right, if you're a person of color. And they shared some of their stories with me. And I thought, it'd be interesting to have this intern at the Frick who's Black, because the Fricks really collected very European centric, it's a lot of women in their fancy dresses and portraits and, Turner landscapes. And so I thought Joshua could bring in what's missing and bring in kind of a fuller context of the art on the Frick's walls, as well as art history in general and the art world in general. And also kind of show Veronica what else is out there. And so it didn't feel quite so Eurocentric. And it was really interesting to research and learn about. And my hope is that by these 2 very different people kind of bouncing off each other in that section, it keeps the momentum going as you're trying to find out what happened back then and what's going to happen to them now. That was a long answer.
No, it's a great answer though. And I'm always so curious, because I think that both timelines are historical, but I think often, me personally, when I talk to authors, I can get very caught up in the older timeline where sort of the bulk of the story in terms of just sheer words on the page lies. But I thought that was a really interesting way at sort of looking at, as you say, this challenge that you laid for yourself. Were there other challenges that you sort of put into this book, or maybe accidentally stumbled across and didn't think they were going to be a challenge when you initially started?
Yeah, definitely the scavenger hunt, because they're following clues that are hidden within the art on the walls and the art around the Frick. And so to do that, I had to do this really deep dive into the paintings that they have, pick paintings that would kind of reflect the theme of the book, and that kind of illuminate the plot and illuminate the characters, because as they're learning about it, what does that say about who they are? And so that was a lot of work. I took an art history class, pass fail in college. So, hey, why shouldn't I write a whole book about it? And I think the challenge was making the art on the Frick walls fun, and making it feel part of the game, and not like, oh, here's a history lesson about a Turner landscape or a Renoir, so that the art becomes an integral part of the story and the plot. And then from that, the challenge was writing the clues, which are really bad poetry that and so, because of the character who writes them, Helen.
I do like the fact that everybody in the book acknowledges it's just not very good poetry, but you know what? It gets the job done. So
It does. And it was so much fun to write bad poetry. I thought it would be more of a challenge than it was. I actually am really good at it, which is kind of frightening. It was so much fun.
I think every author has a secret, or many authors have a secret past of writing really bad poetry as a teenager. So
Yeah,
maybe that's where we're drawing on from when
that's
those
it.
happen in books.
That's it.
One of the things I think is really interesting about your books is that often you're drawing on this really wonderful mix of real people, or people who are very much inspired and drawn on from real people, and then the fiction and kind of the myth and mystery of New York itself, which is a whole thing in and of itself. And we have a couple questions here. First of all, we have a lot of people being very excited about the scavenger hunt and very excited about the Frick and all of that coming to life. But we have a couple questions about sort of that blend of fiction and fact. So one is from Carol, who asks, I really would like to know more about the Magnolia piece. Is that part of a fictional story or the real story?
Yeah, so the Magnolia diamond in the book actually came later. There was a stolen diamond in the plot. And as we were trying to figure out the title, it was really hard because I need titles that reflect not only the building, but also the plot. And in front of the Frick, there are these three beautiful magnolia trees. They're enormous and they're beautiful. Every spring they flower and they're stunning. And so as I was thinking of a title, I was thinking, oh, Magnolia, it's a palace. Great, Magnolia Palace. Let's do that. But then I needed it to reflect something in the plot. And so I made the diamond a pink diamond and
Mm.
called it a Magnolia diamond. So that is completely made up. There is no diamond hidden at the Frick. And
We know of.
right, that we know of. And so yeah, that is completely made up. And I try to make it really clear in the author's note, because there's a lot going on of a mix of fact and fiction in this book, of what's real and what's not. So if you read that, you'll get a very good sense of kind of what's made up, and what's based on some really, really interesting real people.
I love author's notes. I love writing them, but I really love reading them. And I always am very tempted to flip ahead and
Yes,
read the
yes.
other, but often it's so much in terms of spoilers that I have to be careful with myself. But this one in particular was so interesting because you have so many people whose names you can literally Google. And then you have people who are drawn from figures in history. There's a lot going on here. So Gail is asking, could you ask the author if Helen Frick was socially inept, and where that idea came from, or was it a plot device invented to connect two characters with one serving as a sort of Cyrano figure? And then she goes on to say, was Helen as mercurial and difficult as she was made out to be, and how did you research her?
Oh, it's a great. I loved researching Helen. Yeah, so there was a New Yorker article, a huge two-part profile on her from 1939, where it called her a woman of extremely robust prejudices. And that was putting it nicely. And it was this amazing article. And on top of that, there's some really interesting biographies of her as well, written by a descendant of the family, which, she could be very, very difficult. She was known to, if her friends bobbed their hair, which was a very popular hairstyle at the time, she would drop them. She wore a pompadour and a bun pretty much her entire adult life, which says so much about her.
Mhm.
She was just stuck. She was who she was. She never married. She never had kids. She was almost engaged, but that did not work out. And yeah, she was a quirky duck, shall we say. And so it was so much fun to bring her to life, because when her father died in 1919, he left her $38 million, which made her the richest unmarried woman in America. And so she could do anything. And she ended up creating this art reference Library, which is one of the top libraries of today. At the same time, she fought like crazy with the board of the Frick until she finally resigned in a huff in the 60s. You know, she tended to have friends and then get into huge fights with them, and pull away. I don't know, you know, quite what the reason was. I know she had a tough time growing up, with, you know, in the book, her older sister dies when they were both very young, and I think that affected the family greatly. And she was considered her father's partner in many ways. He
Mhm.
really leaned on her to with the art collection, and you know, because his wife really withdrew from society, it was Helen who was his confidant. And so, you know, she was a really complex woman. And I liked the fact that she was vulnerable and difficult and, you know, slightly strange. And it was really fun to bring her to the page. And I love the response. I love so many people say that they love Helen Frick from having read it, because I think she deserves that.
She's such an interesting character because I think sometimes as an author myself, I wonder about whether some of the characters who I write who are a little bit more prickly, a little bit more complex, I wonder if people are going to respond as strongly to them as they respond to this sort of more traditionally heroic heroine of a book. Um, but it's interesting because I've read in recent years 3 of your books, loved them, and each of them had a very complex woman at the center of it. And I'm trying to be really careful about the other ones because I don't want to spoil things. But the Lions of Fifth Avenue,
Yeah.
you know, somebody makes a decision that some people could really judge harshly. In Chelsea Girls, same thing. In, you know, a really difficult political climate, you have somebody make a decision and act in such a way that really could bring a lot of condemnation down on their heads by readers. But it's sort of this unique situation where you're drawing these characters who are so complex that I think it's difficult to write them off entirely. What are you doing there when you're building that character? How are you not drawing just black and white villains and heroes?
I'm definitely drawn to darker heroes. And I think one of the things is writing dual timeline is you have more characters to play with. So
Hmm.
you can make them shades of gray instead of, you know, the valiant heroine trying to do her best. You can make one of the two protagonists quirky or difficult or dark. And I love that contrast, between someone who's kind of innocent and new to the world and someone who is slightly destructive in the world. Because I think, especially with women characters, in the past, you know, women have been the foil to the man in movies and books and TV. And so to give a woman the same freedom to be difficult and to be, you know, a tyrant. It's so interesting you say that, because I'm thinking of all the books, and I think in every one there's some character who you might not like completely, but I think if you dig into the reasons for what they do, why they do it, you become fond of them in a way.
Well, and I think a lot of that also relies on what you do in terms of trying to explain why that character is making the decisions that they're making. And again, you might not necessarily agree with it, but if they had good reason at the time, at least to them, I think that can at least give you a little bit of empathy for them if you don't find them entirely sympathetic when
Yeah,
they
and I think exactly. And I think with Helen and Henry Frick, you know, they're both difficult. And he especially made some horrendous decisions in his life and was the cause of great tragedy. And yet was really safe because he had so much money. You know, he was really insulated from any kind of punishment. And I'm always interested in how that kind of decision affects the generations that come behind them. And so even with the Lions of Fifth Avenue, the library book, it's about the secrets that generations have kept and how that affects the later ones.
Mhm.
And so this book, definitely, there's a definite link between Henry and Helen, and Henry's decisions and Helen's suffering, and why she's mercurial and why she has extremely robust prejudices, you know, where that comes from.
Well, and I think also there's something almost charismatic about Helen also that you know you wouldn't agree to become her personal secretary, even if you were on the run from the law,
Yeah.
and stay on and
Yeah.
develop a fondness for her if there wasn't something kind of compelling and interesting about her as well. So perhaps that says something about Lillian herself, but also there's something about Helen that I think is particularly fascinating as a character, even if you don't like her all the time, because she does some terrible things to people, and she's rude and unpleasant, and you kind of think, I don't know if I would have wanted to know her, but reading about her is really interesting.
Yeah, yeah. I think she's a woman who speaks her mind, and because she's so wealthy, she's allowed to
Hmm.
without consequences. And I think both she and Lillian share this love of art, and that's what binds them. That's what pulls them together, is the idea that art is important.
Hmm.
And so that rises above their completely different natures. You know, one's a wild child artist model, and the other's a very prickly heiress. And so I love that idea of opposites attracting.
Yeah. I'm always really curious with your books about how New York City fits into the book and place fits in. And I think you can't talk about this book without talking about art, as you've said. What is it about these two women in this moment in society, in sort of, I suppose, the Gilded Age or the very end of the Gilded Age, that says so much about the place that they're in? Why this place? Why this time? And why these women?
Yeah, 1919, which is when that section is set, is really a pivotal point because you're coming off from World War One, you're coming off of the Spanish flu, and you're about to head into the Jazz Age. And so much was changing in terms of women's points of view and hemlines, and there's just so much dynamic change in New York at that time, especially coming from the old guard. When you watch the Gilded Age on TV, which is a big hit right now, um, and you see what that 1880s dodgy New York was like. And then you think about the 1920s Prohibition era speakeasy New York, and what a transition to make. So I love the fact that 1919 is right on the cusp of that. And so you have these two women who, in a way, are hamstrung by society, but in a way have each found a way out, a way of expression that many women wouldn't have done at that time. For example, being an artist model for sculptors and posing in the
Mhm.
nude, which is what Lillian does. It's shocking, but at the same time, the art that is created by her job is widely celebrated and considered cultured.
Mhm.
And so I'm just interested in the people behind the scenes, and Lillian was definitely one of those.
Well, and it's so funny you mentioned the fact that it's sort of this transitional and interesting period in history, because even as I asked it, I thought that's not the Gilded Age. It's the interwar period. It's right before the Jazz Age. And sure enough, some characters in this book feel very much frozen in time. I think the Fricks feel very old fashioned to me, and feel very much of that sort of robber baron Gilded Age time. Meanwhile, the outside world is, going on around them. And sure enough, Lillian is trying to get to Hollywood, for a silent film contract. And, the world is changing, but this place is very much anchored in a previous era, perhaps.
Yeah, yeah, you're right. And the house was built in 1914, and it was very much built in that grand mansion, along with the Carnegies and the Vanderbilts. The idea of having this beautiful house on Fifth Avenue was a show of status.
Mhm.
And then what's interesting when you think about it is after Adelaide, the mom, died, Helen moved to just upstate into Westchester, and bought a farm.
Mhm.
And she lived on the farm. And from what it appears, it was a much simpler life. It wasn't a fancy house. So the idea that she went from being brought up in a house where there were three family members and 27 servants to serve those family members, and then went through the Depression era and bought this farmhouse where she lived quite happily
Mhm.
and quite well, but certainly not to the extent of the Gilded Age. She really lived through that transition, which again I find so fascinating.
It is. It absolutely is. We have more questions coming in, so I want to make sure that I don't spend the entire time asking you my own questions. Susan is wondering. She says for both authors, but I, of course, would love to hear from you first. Which is your favorite part of the writing process, the research or the actual writing? Do you ever reach a point where you stop the research and dive into the writing, or do you continue to research along with character and plot development? This, I think, is one of those writing process questions that everybody answers differently.
Yes, yes, so true. Yeah, I love the research. Definitely. I think it's a lot of fun. It's a little panicky, I
Mhm.
find, because I'm hoping I can find enough to fill a novel in the research. But yeah, then I hit a tipping point and I know it's time to start writing. I love editing. I love having a first draft and being able to massage it and get it into shape and make it consistent and bring out the characters more. The one thing I hate is that first draft. I hate writing on a blank page and having to make everything up. I find that so painful. How are you with that?
We're actually, ironically, despite me saying everybody has a different answer, we're
We're the
pretty
same.
close.
Yeah.
I I like parts of the drafting process. I like the beginning and I like the end. The middle, I find, tends, and I'm in the middle right now, I should say, on a book. So I'm living it. The middle tends to be this thing that sort of all the enthusiasm of the beginning and all of the excitement of getting towards the end gets a little bogged down. And it's really where I've just got to figure out what I'm writing about, which sounds silly because I am the type of writer who writes off of a synopsis or an outline.
Yeah.
But I really love that editing process, and I don't know about you, but I attribute it to having been a journalist. I like being edited. I've always liked that collaborative process with an editor. I like self-editing. It's just sort of the way that I've always been built.
There's definitely something about being a journalist that makes us welcome out, because we know we can't see the forest for the trees when you're inside a book. You need someone to give you guidance. Absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. And I think in terms of the research part, I'm sort of consistently doing research along, but normally I'll do some at the beginning and then I'll do a big chunk after that first draft is done because then I know what the holes are and what I've messed up.
Yeah. Yes. Oh,
How
exactly.
about you with the research part of that
I
process?
I tend to do a lot at the beginning and then yeah, a little bit here and there as I go through, just
Okay.
to add on.
Um, we have some questions about, so there's a lots of different things going on here, so I'm going to try to theme them, but I don't know if that's always going to work here. um, Sharon says, thank you for sharing so many photographs of people and places that you write about. How excited are you to find these awesome photographs when you come across them?
Oh, it's so great. And if you go on Facebook, you can see there's a lot of photos I've put up recently of Helen Frick or the various statues that Audrey Munson posed for. And yeah, that's great to find something like that that brings it to life. And luckily the Frick at frick.org, they have the amazing digital archives with photos of the family members and the rooms back when they were, before it was turned into a museum. And that was incredibly helpful. And yeah, I love sharing those. I think it's so interesting to see the real photo of a character who you read about and see if it fits.
What about some of those smaller characters that we know did exist? So, and I might muddle this a little bit because, as you said, there's a lot going into this book that's fictional and a lot that's drawn on real life. What about some of for instance, Helen's erstwhile maybe fiance, and figures like Miss Winnie and other people?
Yeah, I was able to look at the staff payroll so I could see who they were, if, all these different staff members and what they did. And they did have an organist on staff
Mhm.
who he played most of the meals because Mr. Frick liked having organ music during his meals. So he was on the payroll. He did quite well. And then you had all these other, maids and things who slept upstairs on the third floor. And so those were the Winnie and Bertha are inspired by them. And then yeah, so a lot of the characters are kind of rounded out by either what they know about the staff or what I know someone on the staff would have done. So it was kind of pulling it all together that way. So it's a mix of inspired by real people, but mainly what that job might have entailed.
Okay. We have a cheeky question that I like here, or comment, from Lavernier, who says, "Did Fiona make the model Veronica Weber with the mushroom haircut kind of a trigger for Helen's dislike?"
Oh, that's so funny. Yeah, Veronica, I was looking, I knew I wanted her to be a mod 60s model. And I found I have to figure out what the woman's name was, but there was a real model with this mushroom haircut
Mhm.
that, you know, she was beautiful. It was incredible. But I thought, oh, that's great. Like, let's take a character who's kind of an up and coming model and very not sure if that's what she wants to do with her life, and give her this terrible haircut and make her career explode. And so it just puts her in a really strange position. So yeah, that was definitely to bug Helen, you know, the minute she sees her hair and realizes how bad it is.
Well,
That was fun.
having a character who's so modern for the time compared with Helen, again, just sort of continues to this thread of how old-fashioned and out of touch with reality Helen is,
Yeah.
in part because of her personality and in part because of her money too.
Definitely. And you know what, I remember you mentioned about her engagement. And in fact, apparently, according to the biography, she was almost engaged to a very handsome doctor. But her father in real life discouraged it. And he went off to World War I and met a nurse and ended up marrying her. And they ended up being friends.
Hmm.
But yeah, she almost got married, but it just was not to be.
What about the relationship with her and her brother? I know there was a lot of tension and estrangement after the will was read. What about when her father was still alive? Was that relationship still very rocky?
It was tricky, apparently, according to what I've read. You know, the son ended up living on Long Island with his family. He was very into fossils and more of a scientist type. He rejected the whole art, you know, hobby that Helen and her father shared. And yeah, after his death, there was a lot of resentment at how much money Helen got
Mhm.
from the will. There was a question about what happened in terms of a sleeping draft that he was given and who gave it to him.
So that's a
That's a real
real
thing.
suspicion.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
really interesting.
And I don't know if maybe eventually they ended up making up, but according to what I've read, it was a strained relationship and a lot of resentment on both parts.
Mhm. We have a question here about the 1960s timeline from Anissa. She said, "I found it very interesting that the modern day timeline was only 3 days. Did that make it harder to write than the other timeline?"
You know, it's so funny. Hi, Anissa. In a way, it made it harder and easier because it didn't require all the research that I would have to do normally about the 1960s New York. You know, what restaurants are they going to eat at? What was the hotel that she would stay at? All of that kind of really detailed stuff. Because they were stuck in the mansion during a blizzard, it gave me a freedom to just focus on their characters, which I really enjoyed. And it's probably a third of the book in terms of the total amount of pages. And so it was really fun, actually. It was very freeing to just focus on these two people and who they were and what they were trying to do. And are they getting in each other's way? And what would it be like being trapped in a big mansion with a stranger for 3 days? You know? So in a way, I would say it was easier to write than the normal storyline would have been.
Mary says, "I love the scene where Helen shows up in the frick and scares the heck out of Veronica and Joshua. I love the fact that you get this moment where you unite your two timelines, which is something that you don't always get to do in historical fiction. Or if you do, it's sort of at the end of somebody's life, it's sort of a very reflective thing. And I can say this because I've written this before. And they're not nearly as active a figure in the story as Helen is in the 1960s. What was what was your thinking with writing that scene? Did you want to achieve anything in particular when you were sort of setting out bringing these people together?
Yeah, you know, in each book, in each timeline, I'll have one timeline end happy, one will end tragically. I've changed it up with each book because I like to keep the reader guessing, and that's the way life is. Sometimes things work out well, and sometimes they don't. With this one, I love the idea that everything came together, and that there was a things were resolved. And so people could apologize, and there could be a reckoning in many ways 50 years later. And so, yeah, I definitely wanted that to happen. I knew the ending before I started writing it. I knew that they would all come together and there'd be some kind of conclusion that felt both surprising but also satisfying.
Mhm. We have a lot of questions about whether there's been any film interest in this book. And I know that these are things that you can't talk about until you can talk about them. So maybe you can just give us a blanket sort of where are we right now answer.
Who knows? It would be wonderful. I think that would be absolutely great. And I always say there's just such an interest, I think, in historical fiction on screen these days, between the Gilded Age and the Queen's Gambit. So fingers crossed it works out. I think it would be a great movie.
I agree. I agree. And wonderfully visual well, all your books are very visual and wonderful in terms of you can feel the real places that they're set. And but this one in particular, I think with such a strong art thread through it would be really fantastic.
Yeah. Yeah. They could just shut down the Frick and film it for a few months.
Yeah.
Come on.
I'm sure the Frick wouldn't mind, right? Debbie actually wants to know a bit more about the art. How did you decide on which pieces of art to include in the scavenger hunt?
Yeah, so it would be something like finding something like there's one Lady Hamilton as Nature, which is a shot of a kind of fresh-faced innocent woman holding a dog. And and I thought, oh, it's an interesting painting. But then I learned about the history. And keep in mind, you can go on frick.org and they have a floor plan where you can go into any room and look around and click on any art, and it will tell you what the kind of the backstory is.
That must be
And so I was
wonderful.
doing that. So I click on that and I learned that the woman who posed for this painting started out, as a mistress and became a muse to an artist. So I'm always interested in, okay, she was a muse for a famous artist in England and led this kind of wild life that ended very tragically. And so by choosing that painting and having Veronica learn about the history, she can reflect on what that means to her as a model and how have women's roles changed over time. Will she, as a muse in many ways, go on and have a similar tragic end? How have things changed? And so it was really finding that backstory for each painting so that it could really come alive and not just be, paint on canvas, but about the people behind it, about the artists and the people who posed.
Well, and it's wonderful when you have a book with an artist model who so rarely are recognized. And as you said, we're only now really starting to understand who this woman was, the real figure, the real Angelica. It sort of makes such sense, and it's such a nice nod to that.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think that, a lot of the book is the difference between being looked at and being seen. And what is that like for women over time?
There's a lot of love for both of our bookshelves, which I think both of us very much appreciate. I'm going to speak for both of us there. You're in your office, is that right?
Yes. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about what your writing day is like? I'm assuming it starts and ends in that office, but
Yeah. 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 I have an apartment on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. And so that's where I get a lot of the work done. And yeah, I tend to do a lot of work in the morning if it's editing or writing. And then the afternoon, it's more for business and promo and all that kind of thing, or going out and starting to do research for a new book and that. I just find I'm better in the morning
Mhm.
in terms of writing. Are you the same way? Are you a night owl?
No, I used to be a night owl, but working really changed that. So, I find that my ideal day is doing the writing in the morning. It's when I'm freshest. It's when I'm most focused. If things kind of need to get attended to, today was a bit like that. There were some things that came in overnight because I have that time gap
Oh,
between
yeah.
zone issue. So there's some times that I don't see emails until a little bit later. So I ended up actually doing most of my writing in the afternoon, which is, it's okay. It gets done. It gets done. But my ideal day would be words in the morning, editing in the morning, and then working on marketing and things like that in the afternoon, because it's a different headspace, I think.
Definitely. Definitely.
What are When you say researching a new book, what are the usually the first steps that you're taking when you're looking at a new project?
Yeah, one of the first things I do is I talk to an architectural historian named Andrew Alpern, who's a real New York City. He's just an expert on all things architectural and historical in New York. And so the first thing I do is take him out to lunch and say, all right, I'm thinking about this building. What do you got? And he'll share with me any of, the things he knows about the backstory or, characters involved. And there's always something when I talk to him that just makes me think, oh yeah, that's great. For example, with the Lions of Fifth Avenue, he told me about this incredible book theft in a library here in New York. And that inspired me to model it on my library. And so yeah, so I try to talk to him. I go out and see the building, try and get inside it, try and get a behind the scenes tour with the Frick. They gave me a wonderful tour from the basement where that bowling alley that's in one scene that actually exists. And so being able to see this amazing bowling alley and realizing, oh, I have to set a scene there.
Yep.
And then all the way up to the top rooms where the maids would sleep that are now offices and storage and that kind of thing. But it really helps give me a spatial sense of what this building is and start imagining scenes taking place in different rooms and that kind of thing. So that I really try and get out. It's not about being on the internet and looking things up. It's about getting out there and finding experts and seeing what I can see.
When you are looking for experts, are you primarily drawing on people who've written books that you've read, or is it sort of, there's a breadcrumb and you're following the trail?
It's a little bit of both. I'll definitely find books, like there's some amazing books on the Fricks that I've read. And I reached out to the former director of the Frick, who's now at the Morgan, and had to sit down with him. Yeah, it's about kind of people who know either the building or the era that I want to write in. So if someone's written a great book about the 1910s, I'll reach out to them and say, hey, do you have 20 minutes for a quick interview? And just get some specific questions going to help illuminate the research that I'm doing.
Sure. It's sort of all of the information gathering in the beginning stages.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, my next question is going to be, do you know what you're writing about next?
Oh, that's so funny you say that, because right next to me is, how there's always a lag between when a book comes out. So
Always.
This book was published in January, but it was turned in, back in May of last year. So there's a lot of lag time. So of course, since then I've been working. So here is
that's exciting.
The first draft of the next book, which is set at Radio City Music Hall, from the point of view of a Rockette. And yeah, that's, I know I'm kind of dreading looking at it because, after a first draft, there's so much work still to be done. It's only the beginning. I do about 10 drafts. So I'm getting ready to start reading through that, and we'll see how that goes.
I think Radio City Music Hall sounds fascinating. I remember years and years ago, driving back from college and listening. It was the very birth of podcasts, and Bowery Boys was one of the first podcasts that I listened to, and they're wonderful, and they've done everything under the sun. So I think this was probably their first iteration of Radio City Music Hall. I'm sure they've done it multiple times since then. But I remember specifically somewhere in Oklahoma listening to this podcast about Radio City Music Hall because I was so excited to be moving to New York, having never lived there before. So I'm particularly interested in that one.
Oh, I love it. And in fact, speaking of early research, the Bowery Boys podcast, that's one of the first places I go, because they have, even with the Frick, they have a great one on the mansions that were built that includes the Frick. They have another one that's all dedicated to Audrey Munson, who the character Lillian is based on. And they go in depth, and oh yeah, they're fantastic.
Well, I was going to ask, do you have recommendations of sort of pop culture and media, if people are particularly interested in New York City history and sort of this sort of less known elements of New York City history?
Yeah, there's a great website called oldnyc.org, and that has a map of New York City. And if you click on any corner, it will show you all the photographs they've compiled through time of that corner. So you can look and see, all right, here's, Bryant Park in the 1930s. Here's Bryant Park in the 1880s. It's incredible. And that's a fun one. The Bowery Boys, definitely. And then there's a great newsletter that I get every Monday, and it's Ephemeral New York, EPHERMERAL. And that is usually 3 different articles about some aspect of old New York and talk about story ideas. I mean, every time I get one, I think, oh, that could be a book. And it's a great newsletter and a great way to see how New York's changed over time.
What do you think it is about New York that keeps drawing you back and keeps drawing readers back to your books?
I think it's got such a storied history, and the neighborhoods have changed so drastically over the decades. And so when I'm writing about the city, I'm really usually, if it's two timelines, I'm writing about 2 very different cities. And I think people love that. For me, I just love the idea of stepping back in time and seeing what it was like back then. And writing is just a way to do that, to kind of transport myself to the 1880s or the 1920s and see, look around and see what the world was like back then. And New York is just very rich because there's just layers of history in every building, on every block, in every neighborhood. And so there's so much to play with. And for me, it's convenient because I live here. So it's really easy to research.
Oh, I can't knock it. I do the same thing. So, I think just having lived there for a while, and then I haven't been back since 2019, but even so I left May 2017. I went back July 2019, when I actually think you and I met up for the first time in person. Even in those 2 years, the city had changed and it felt different from the city that I knew. And part of that is when you leave and then you come back, you realize New York is, even living in a major metropolitan area like London, New York is just different. It just feels different. The energy is different. But even the things that I knew to be familiar were gone, changed, morphing. It's a city that constantly turns over. And I think it's really interesting that you mentioned there's so much change between neighborhoods, even within timelines that are, 50 years apart, you will see change.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I remember Andrew Alpern, my famed historian. He always says, the New York that you want most or that you love most is the one that was there when you first arrived. And in a way, when you first arrive, that New York is preserved in amber.
Yes.
And then all the changes that happen just aren't good enough compared to that. No matter when you came, it could have been the 70s, and that to you is the ultimate best New York.
And that's very true. Speaking to New Yorkers who, remember the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, whatever it is, you're absolutely right. It's sort of, New York is never quite as good as it was when it was first brand new to them and they were first sort of really experiencing it. And it's really interesting that it seems to be this almost universal trait amongst New Yorkers that is their experience, and they will not be told any other thing. My New York was the New York of sort of 2008, 2009. So a lot was changing because the financial crash had happened. But it in and of itself was this really unique experience. It was a really, really interesting place to be, a very unsettled place to be at the time. So yeah, it's interesting hearing that he has that to say about it, because I think he's spot on.
Yes, definitely. Definitely.
Well, I want to be sure to ask you about what you're reading and historical fiction recommendations. We've had a couple of questions around book recommendations, and obviously, this is a book club, so we want to make sure we get a chance to chat about those. So, is there anything in particular that you've been enjoying recently?
Yeah, this has gotten a lot of press, but The Christie Affair by Nina de Gramont.
I think mine is the.
You have it? Yeah.
We can show off the UK and the US editions. So.
Oh, look at that! Oh my goodness, it's so different.
It's very different. Yeah, it's just the gloves and then the graphic background.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, so I love that. I thought that was, and I just listened to a podcast where she was talking, which was really fascinating as to how she came upon the idea and that kind of thing. And then, there's so much coming down the pike in terms of historical fiction. But one book that's actually not historical fiction, it's contemporary fiction, is this one, Guilt by Jamie Brenner.
Oh, I don't know.
And it has a pink diamond in it as well, so I have to share this.
Great.
And it comes out in June 21st. And she writes just great contemporary fiction with incredible female characters. There's a pink diamond. It's all about jewelry. It's wonderful. So I highly recommend that one.
Wonderful. Are you reading a lot of books for blurbs for advanced reader copies and things like that?
Yeah, yeah. It's been wonderful. That's one of the fun things about becoming an author is you get early copies of books. And so yeah, I'm working my way through a number of those right now. It's exciting.
I'm doing the same as well. And I have to say, I really enjoy it. And there's something really uniquely wonderful about finding, especially a debut author whose book you
Mhm.
really love. And then you
Yeah.
can go and shout about it to the world. So
Yes, there's a book, The Tobacco Wives by Adele Myers, which comes out sometime this spring. And that's a debut that is going to just take the world by storm. It's great.
do you have any books that you find yourself going back to over and over again to recommend when people are asking about sort of what are the books that have changed your, your reading life or the things that you really love?
Yeah, I love this book called The Perfume Collector by Kathleen Tesori. Tesoro, I have it somewhere. And that's one of the first dual timeline novels that I thought, oh, how does she do it? And I
Mm.
really examined it and took apart the structure to see how she managed it. It's a great story. And then I love The Secret Garden. I'll go back and reread that every so often. There's something about that story of redemption and growth that I love. It's almost like a Cinderella story in many ways. And then there's a book called People of the Book by Geraldine Brooks. And that's historical fiction, kind of going back and forth in time, covers a huge time span and follows just a book. And it's history from the Spanish Inquisition onto modern day and how the people around this book have been affected, a Jewish sacred text. It's beautiful.
That sounds really interesting, and I suspect that will be right in the sweet spot for a lot of people who are watching
Yes,
now.
yes.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for doing this and for answering everybody's questions. It's been absolutely fantastic, and I hope people got a little bit more insight into some of the more spoiler-filled elements of the book than we would normally get to chat about when we're doing interviews like this.
Well, thank you for having me. This is just great. And thank you everybody for tuning in and asking those great questions. It was fun to be able to talk about the book.
Absolutely. Well, you guys who are watching right now, I will be in the next few days announcing who the March book club pick will be. Some shrewd people who maybe have looked at the events scheduling on my Facebook page might be able to work that out. But thank you again so much for watching, and please spread the word and spread the word about this fantastic, fantastic book. It's been really wonderful getting a chance to go behind the scenes with you, Fiona.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
No problem.